Okay. Okay, so we'll start. We'll do a slower start. So as people start coming in, we'll get to the conversation once we reach a good mass. So hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. This is the first day of the Undocumented Student Week of Action, hosted by the Dream ND community and co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Languages and Cultures, the Institute for Latino Studies, the Center for University Advising, the University Counseling Center, and the Office of Student Enrichment. We also want to thank Campus Ministry for a prayer service that is finishing up at this very moment on campus, with a reflection by Father Pete McCormick and music by Coro Primavera de Nuestra Señora. We welcome you all to join us for other events this week. Please see the chat for the link and registration to the events. If you are calling in and you don't see the chat, please, you can reach out to one of us, the Office of Student Enrichment, or Kristen Klosky, or myself, Leonore Wangenstein, and we'll be happy to send you registration information. So my name is Leonore Wangenstein. I'm a first-year academic advisor, and I am the director of Undocumented Student Initiatives under the Center for University Advising. I work very closely with Kristen Klosky. For the last 7 years now, we have cohorts every year of undocumented and documented undergraduates and graduate students that we're continuously building support for. I'll have Kristen introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Klosky. I'm the project coordinator for the Office of Student Enrichment. I work closely with Leonore, focusing on a student affairs lens for our DACA and undocumented students.
Okay, so this event is called A Conversation on Current State and Federal Immigration Policies, and we hope that it does turn into a conversation. We will begin by introducing our guests, Lisa Coop, Sam Centellas, and Rudy Monterosa. Lisa Coop will start us off with a short overview of some current immigration issues and policies. We will then start the conversation with a few initial questions for our guests. In the meantime, please add your own questions in the chat publicly, or if you prefer to send any questions privately, please direct them to Kristen Klosky, who will be managing the chat. And Kristen will share your questions as we continue the conversation, okay? So to start off with introductions, Lisa Coop, where are you? There, okay. Is the Associate Director of Legal Services at the National Immigrant Justice Center, NIJC. She directs NIJC's Asylum Project, handles federal litigation, and provides representation and supervision in deportation defense matters. Ms. Coop specializes in litigation, policy, and direct services advocacy on behalf of immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. She heads NIJC's Indiana office and is an adjunct professor at Notre Dame Law School. Ms. Coop graduated magna cum laude from Indiana University McKinney School of Law in 2004.
Sam Centellas is the Executive Director of La Casa de Amistad, a Latino-focused nonprofit community center on the west side of South Bend, Indiana. Sam was born in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and came to the States in first grade. He grew up in Michigan, loves cars, and is an engineer by trade, an administrator by training, and an educator by heart. Since joining the staff at La Casa in 2013 and under Sam's leadership at La Casa, they have launched its immigration legal program, new youth programs, city ID programs, and helped to start West Side Wednesday to empower immigrant and Latino-owned businesses. In 2021, the organization will move to a newly renovated 400,000 square foot building to increase their reach and impact the community. Sam was appointed by the Mayor of South Bend as a commissioner to the Housing Authority and to the Diversity Utilization Board, helping develop minority and women-owned businesses. Advocacy is a core part of Sam's life, and he currently serves on many local and national boards, including the Board of Directors of Notre Dame Federal Credit Union, Indiana University South Bend, and is a national trustee with his Latino Fraternity Education Foundation.
Okay, and then we have Rudy Monterosa. He has practiced criminal, immigration, personal injury, and family law in South Bend, Indiana since 2001. He is the founding attorney of the Monte Rosa Law Group, LLC. Monte Rosa serves as an adjunct professor at the Notre Dame Law School, where he teaches courses on immigration and nationality law. In 2009, the Hispanic Law Students Association at the Notre Dame Law School honored him with the prestigious Graciela Olivares Award. Monte Rosa has a BA in psychology from Stanford University and a JD from the Notre Dame Law School. While in law school, Monte Rosa served as a law clerk, first for the office of the district attorney in San Bernardino, California, and then for the office of the federal public defender in Reno, Nevada. He continues to maintain a strong sense of service to the community throughout his professional career. He served as a commissioner on the Indiana Supreme Court's Commission on Race and Gender Fairness in the Courts, as a commissioner with the American Bar Association's Commission on Hispanic Rights and Responsibilities, and as president of the board for the nonprofit Latino organization La Casa de Amistad. These are very condensed bios for these wonderful guests that we have today. So we'll turn it over to Lisa for a short presentation, and then as you have any questions, please start adding them to the chat.
Yeah, hey everybody. Hi, I'm Lisa. It is a real pleasure to be speaking with you all tonight, especially with my good friends Rudy and Sam. One of the really cool things about the immigrant advocacy community in Northern Indiana is it's a pretty collaborative, friendly place. So we're glad to have you all as a part of the work that we do for immigrant communities right here in Indiana, where we all do our work. I wanted to kind of set the context a little bit on what we're talking about, but also recognize that, you know, we can go whatever direction is of interest to you. But, you know, if our theme is, you know, where are we at our point in history as to the US immigration system? It's really, I think people like overuse the term inflection point, but we do sort of seem to be at one where we had, you know, the build up to the election and all this hope and all these, you know, immigration planks of the Democratic Party platform. And then, you know, thank goodness I'm showing my political stripes here, but I was very glad to see the end of the Trump administration and the opportunity to begin to undo the damage that was done to the immigration system, not just the asylum system, not just the border issues, but to all of, you know, pretty much the entire immigration system, including family-based processing, protections for survivors of violence, protections for LGBTQ immigrants. All of those things were rolled back during those 4 years. And so, you know, everyone, I think there was a lot of energy around this concept that we could begin to rebuild some of those things and start to claw back some of those due process protections and access to benefits and justice for immigrants in our communities. And then we really got mired. So Biden came into office in January and like right off the bat issued some wonderful executive orders, said some great things about expanding and protecting DACA. So that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, this program that's been around since 2012 that protects non-citizens who came to the United States largely as youth and have lived here and been a part of our communities. And it's been a critical program, but it's never been enough, right? DACA on its own has never been enough. We've always had this need to push it forward and turn it into something that is more permanent because it's an executive action, which means it's just something the president did. It wasn't a law that Congress passed. And so with Biden coming into office, there was a lot of hope that Congress would be moved to act and to make that program into something with a path to lawful permanent residency and ultimately citizenship. So that was really big and exciting at the beginning, all of this talk about new legislation. And then as the Biden administration started to wind down some of the programs that were happening at the border. So under the Trump administration, there was this Migrant Protection Protocols or MPP program through which asylum seekers were forced to remain in Mexico and try to pursue protection and put together these really complicated legal requests for relief from Mexico to present before courts along the border in the southern US. And kind of as that program began to unwind, and there's still a lot of work to do to get all of those people that have been subject to MPP into the United States, as that happened and as there began to be a recognition that we were under new administration, you started to see a lot of attention focused on the southern border. So that's really like, if you open the paper and you talk about immigration right now, you're not reading about DACA, you're not reading about like, oh, we're going to reconfigure the way we construe unlawful presence, or we're going to reform the immigration courts. What you're reading about is the border. You're reading about like, oh, unaccompanied minors arriving at the border and being stuck in Border Patrol stations, which is awful and needs to be remedied. But those issues have really taken up all the air in the room. And so right now, there hasn't been space to talk about all of these other immigration reforms and issues that we really need to push forward. So we can spend some time this evening talking about what's going on in the border. Is this really, you know, kids in cages 2.0, 3.0, whatever, however we want to describe it. But we should also talk about what's happening in our own community here and how the ripple effects of this stagnation on immigration issues you know, is impacting our own community. And we are only, what, 2 or 3 months into this administration, and so we have to cut them some slack, but at the same time, you know, there needs to be sort of a recognition that we can't just stay focused on the border, and these other issues are of critical importance. So maybe with that, we can start answering your questions. I will say the one thing, you know, on DACA in particular, there was legislation that passed in the House of Representatives, right? So that's good and positive, but we're kind of stuck in the Senate. And part of the reason why the Senate is saying like, oh, we can't even touch this legislation to regularize DACA is because they're saying, but the border, there's like this crisis at the border. And so that's really, again, limiting the ability for these good things to happen. We are grateful that temporary protected status for Venezuelans has been announced, which is fantastic. TPS for Burmese students, protections for Liberian immigrants has been great. Renewal of Syrian TPS is excellent, but there's a lot more work to do. So we're excited to be talking to all of you about where we need to be pushing this conversation.
Thanks, Lisa. I might change the order of the questions I have because I feel like one kind of jumps off of a little bit of what you were talking about. So so you mentioned like there's been a flurry of new immigrant announcements, executive orders, policy changes, new task forces, and programs in the first weeks of Biden's administration. On Biden's first day in office, he proposed an immigration bill, the U.S. Citizen Act of 2021, that features a pathway to citizenship for a large number of undocumented immigrants. After several decades of Congress failing to pass multiple DREAM Acts and other large immigration reform bills, this new multiple train strategy may be gaining traction in Biden's administration. So maybe that's part of the question, is kind of breaking that down a little bit for us. What is why multiple trains? Why do you think that's necessary, or might do something more than the bigger package? And then the aim of the strategy is to mobilize smaller separate bills that would target citizenship and other reforms for certain unauthorized immigrant subgroups. And one of these subgroups are essential workers. That was brought up, you know, in this last year that we've seen through the pandemic. And many of these announcements seek to restore and advance a more humane and equitable immigration system. Do you sense that these announcements give a renewed sense of hope to our immigrant communities and advocates? And what is the reality at the ground level? What's still, you mentioned a little bit of what the actual reality is. What's this hope versus what's actually still going on for individuals and families that are still suffering through a humanitarian crisis that don't have immediate solutions?
Yeah, Rudy or Sam, you want to hop in?
I'll say something short. Let me just real short, and then you can give the legal answer. So the one thing that I always like to just jump in whenever and I'm not an attorney. I don't even play one on TV. But whenever we talk about these things, I usually like to ask, especially for an educated audience right here, I'm assuming I'm talking to Notre Dame faculty, staff, and students. How many of you understand what's happening around any of this legislation? Fully understand? And it's like nobody raises their hand except the attorneys in the room, right? So imagine how our community feels in terms of this galvanizing hope. It actually creates almost more despair because folks have no idea. What does that mean? Is it going to pass? Is it not going to pass? If it does pass, does it qualify for me? Does it qualify for my son? You know, like maybe I'm excited because this might work for my child, but it's not going to work for me or for my parent. And so like really what's happening now is at this phase, people think like we're celebrating, like things are moving. And from a community standpoint, I feel like there's actually more despair because the activity without resolution just creates anxiety. And so I, you know, and I'm, you know, a child immigrant, I'm a US citizen. And so, you know, I can't put myself in those shoes, but I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of either undocumented or mixed status families, really what's happening creates a lot of anxiety. And, you know, for us as advocates, it's easy to talk about like, well, it's a long game and it's a strategy piece. We're going to get this piece and then that piece. You know, when we're talking about that, there's a lot of people's lives that on a daily basis are impacted. And so whereas obviously these things are very important to pay attention to, be involved in, utilize your privilege when you can to advocate for others, understand that in the community, all of this talk about them is anxiety. Because once again, you know, immigrants are being used as a bargaining chip and a token in a lot of these pieces. And it really creates more anxiety for them. So that's part of what I wanted to share before, you know, Rudy or Lisa can give a more kind of legal about what's really happening and maybe should people have hope and is that coming?
You know, what I was going to add is I really like what Lisa had mentioned about the fact that there's all this focus with regard to what's happening at the border. And here we have a bill that's proposed before Congress that's going to work towards fixing a broken immigration system. And I think that's what we need to realize is that really we're talking about two different things. One thing is like, I take a look at my parents. My mother is from Mexico. When she came to the United States, she came here because she heard about the American dream. And my grandfather worked in the fields of San Jose picking lettuce and was able to petition for my mother to be able to come here to this country. And she's like, yeah, let me go there so I can earn better, so I can live my American dream. So she came here because she wanted to stay here. That's immigration. My father, on the other hand, comes from El Salvador, and he left his country because he was fleeing persecution. It was the beginning of the Civil War. And so when he came to the United States, he was coming here because he was seeking protection. He was seeking asylum. And so that's what's happening at the border, right? These are individuals that are fleeing gang warfare, violence in their countries in Central America. Many of those individuals are from that area. And so and it's not just here in the United States, it's been throughout the country. You know, we had this, there was Sam was part of this as well. This, the bishops had or I think it was a Catholic conference, it was a global conference. And we had an advocate from South Africa talking about the same issues, right? Talking about the same idea that we're convoluting this idea that if I'm coming to this country seeking protection, that it's the same thing as I'm coming to this country because I want to come to this country to make this better way of life. And so I think that it's important for us to be able to recognize that there's a difference. And then the other is that, you know, we keep talking about let's have people do things the right way and why don't they follow the law? You know, here we are proposing a bill that's going to take care of these issues, and yet it's a matter of time to see whether or not it's going to happen, right? You know, I know that we're talking about a week of action. That's going to be my call later on, that those of us that are here in this call and those of us who may be watching this afterwards, we need to call our representatives and tell them how we feel about these issues with regard to immigration, because it doesn't just affect somebody who's undocumented or somebody who's an immigrant. It affects all of us, because whether we like it or not, immigrants are very much a part of our lives, be it that they're here lawfully or unlawfully. You know, they're making contributions to our society. And so I believe that we need to be able to step up and speak up, you know, for our fellow man, for our fellow, you know, sister, brother, what have you, because these are individuals who are very much a part of our community. And I think that that's something that we need to start being able to not be afraid to engage in.
Yeah, I can say maybe a little more about the nuts and bolts of the bill, and also just like as a broader theme, you know, like looking for like where is this space for hope in the current climate? I think you know, a lot of us are really frustrated that things aren't happening more quickly. And it's really easy to say like, oh, Biden's the same as Trump, like nothing has changed. And that's not true. Like we are in a different era. We are in a space where we are having conversations that, you know, were completely foreclosed under the last administration. We are now in a space where there are people that have moved into political positions in the administration that are pro-immigrant, that are pro-human rights, that are pro-due process, and that, you know, are really working to try and again, like undo everything that was you know, ensnared in under the last administration. So are they moving quickly enough? Are they doing the precise things that we want them to do? Probably not. But I do think we have to retain the awareness that there are people in there that, you know, for whom, you know, they are operating in good faith, which could not necessarily have been said of the government a few months ago. So the bill that passed the House of Representatives did a lot of good things. It's a big bill. It's hundreds of pages. And it again is a huge accomplishment for grassroots organizers, for United We Dream, for all of the organizations that have been pushing for a path to citizenship for documented families, youth, individuals for years and years. And so we don't want to diminish the accomplishment in getting that passed in the House of Representatives, because that is significant. What was a really tough pill to swallow was the fact that kind of at the 11th hour, a lot of the things that we had hoped to keep out of the bill kind of worked their way in. There were a lot of compromises made, not by advocates, but by legislators. And so there are some criminal bars in the legislation that we don't like. You know, we feel very strongly, and by we, I mean, you know, I think advocates pushing this. For me, I'm speaking on behalf of the National Immigrant Justice Center where I work, but I think more broadly advocates in support of positive legislation for immigrant communities. We're frustrated that some of those criminal bars were left in the bill. So what that means is a lot of our Black and Brown community members that have been subjected to racial profiling, that have had contact with the criminal justice system, that we know flows from structural racism and white supremacy, the types of things that flow from that contact are now going to prohibit some people from accessing protections under this bill. So that's really problematic to us, that the idea that, you know, some of these, the criminal bars were retained in the bill. And then, like I said before, there's not a co-sponsor in the House. There's not a reciprocal bill or in the Senate being introduced right now. So this bill passed, which is great and exciting, but it doesn't really have anywhere to go just yet. And so that's something that is, you know, there's all this excitement in communities. And like Sam said, like, it's really kind of head spinning for immigrants in the community. Like, is there a new law? How, you know, how is this filtering out into the news? Like, is there something I should be signing up for? Should I pay the notary down the block $500 to like mark my place in line to get this bill? We see a lot of exploitation of immigrant communities that flows from this sort of messaging that like, oh, there's this bill out there, and if you don't apply for it right now, then you're gonna, you know, miss the train altogether and be left out. So, you know, trying to communicate to communities that nothing has passed yet, there's no change in the law yet, there's nothing to sign up for yet, I think is an important and significant part of our work. And we've been doing with La Casa de Amistad, with Sam's organization and with some other community partners, we've been doing Facebook Live events, you know, trying to make accessible to the community just sort of a very direct and clear message of what's happened and what hasn't happened. But I think, Leonore, the idea that this will probably move forward in separate bills is that's sort of the conventional wisdom right now, is that we're probably not going to see one big omnibus like immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform bill go forward. Probably what's going to happen is there will be smaller pieces. So maybe it'll be a path to status for individuals with DACA. Maybe it will be something to get rid of unlawful presence, which sounds like so mundane and boring and awful, but these unlawful presence bars, these punishments or rules that kick in if someone has been undocumented in the United States and then has to leave in order to regularize their status through a family member, they get hit with these bars, either a 3 or 10 year bar that says you can't come back into the United States for 10 years because you've been unlawful in the United States for years. That destroys families, that destroys lives. Like, we need to get rid of those stupid bars, which probably Congress didn't fully understand what they were doing when they created those back in 1996. So some of these like little tinkering around the edges things will actually have a huge impact on communities. So we're hopeful that some of those sorts of smaller vehicles might make their way forward. Another one is false claims to citizenship. So Right now, you know, when you go apply for a job and they give you that I-9 and you have to check a box that says if you're a lawful permanent resident, if you're a citizen. If you're not a citizen and you check that box that says you're a citizen, you've now made a false claim to United States citizenship. And that's like a death sentence in the immigration context, because it means you're never going to be able to fix your papers through a family member, through most channels of legal immigration processes by virtue of having made this false claim to citizenship. So that's one that we're really hoping to fix. And then another big one would be a lot of our organizations do work with immigrant survivors of crimes. Oftentimes that crime is domestic violence, and our clients become eligible for this thing called a U visa, which is a visa that's available to survivors of crimes that have shown, it's a law enforcement tool. So it's something that kind of police and investigators and prosecutors asked for back in 2000. This visa was created that allows for immigrant survivors of crime to obtain a visa if they can show they've been useful in the investigation or prosecution of a crime. The problem is there are only 10,000 of those visas available nationwide every year. So the line to get those visas has become so long that it's now taking 5, 6, like maybe even 10 years to actually get that visa. So we need Congress to lift that cap. So these are all these like little finicky things that aren't going to grab headlines probably, but would have a huge impact on immigrant communities. So those are sort of spaces where we're looking to push, even if we can't get a big comprehensive immigration bill to move forward.
Well, thank you. That was that added a lot of details. You mentioned the importance of clear messaging. And so we get a lot of, I mean, social media, it has pros and cons to it, right? So there's the myths versus realities of immigration have been problematic for decades, right? So there are many myths that surround the reasoning behind why immigrants come to the United States. And I appreciate Rudy's response and example from his own family of different types and reasoning of why his parents are here. But some of the myths that we hear, for instance, are these people are coming here to take jobs, right, quote unquote, or take advantage of government benefits. I don't know if you might want to mention something about the public charge and what that might mean right now. Another myth that spreads is like this idea of like, oh, there's a line to wait in and to gain like legal residency and citizenship. So we're just curious in kind of your day-to-day own line of work, for individuals that do not understand the complexities and the history of US immigration, how do you engage in those? How do you engage with someone who first approaches you with these kind of myths?
So I'll jump on that one maybe first from an advocate standpoint. But so I think a couple things, just core tenet pieces, and I'll use the jobs one as an easy example. Oftentimes advocates, in my opinion, make the mistake of saying, well, they come here to work jobs Americans don't want, right? Or whatever. And I think that's counter to our narrative, right? So they're coming because of the economy, because there's opportunity, right? And so I think it's easy to deflect versus making it, like they're doing stuff we don't want to do. Right. And that's not a good sales pitch, because it obviously hasn't worked, because that's what people have been trying to say for a long time. So, I use things like the American economy is so strong. People want to come here to work. We want our economy to be strong, don't we? Do we want our economy to crumble and then no one wants to come here? No, we should be a country that people want to come to. And so that's kind of how I talk about those kind of things. So being careful not to use considering immigrants in our community as less than, right? And so because they're less than, it's okay for them to be here. And so I always talk about the strengths that they bring to communities, and that they make everything. One of my jokes that I use for advocates is I always say, think about the top 5 places in the United States people want to live. And people always list New York, Miami, LA. I'm like, those are people that have a lot of immigrants, right? There's not a lot of people that are clamoring to move to Monticello, Indiana, right? And so it's a way to see these are the great things that immigrants bring to the community, and they're not harming anybody. And then the same thing with people are coming here, and this is where I'll use some data on this one. People talk about the whole thought around coming here to get benefits and to get free things, and generally you can't, explain away, and you don't want to get into the whole rules around STEP benefits and who gets this and whatever, like that makes it's all difficult. But even right here, our very own, Luis Fraga in his book. So Luis Fraga is a professor, the director of the Institute for Latino Studies, for folks that don't know him. But in his book, he talks about this national Hispanic survey that was done, thousands and thousands of people interviewed, and it shows that Latinos have a negative perception to social services. They don't want free things. They don't want to have handouts. I mean, the folks came here to work. Folks came here for opportunity, to advance themselves and their families. They don't want free things, and that's part of like just using that narrative. And we talk about that at La Casa all the time, how we don't consider ourselves a charity. And all of the families that come to La Casa in one way, shape, or form are paying for services. They're generally paying what they can afford. If they can't afford it, right, we figure it out. But generally, they want to pay for whether it's our preschool or our legal services or you name it. And I actually joke that if our preschool was free, families wouldn't sign up because one, they'd be like, "What kind of free preschool are you running?" But two, like they want to pay their share. And so we talk a lot about that as our way to break it versus like getting into the legal rigmarole on, if my immigrant family was able to qualify for social services or not, or what's happening. I think it's important for advocates to understand that in the background. But most people, when you're like having an argument about immigrants, are not arguing the details of the law with you. They're arguing something that they feel and something that they feel that's probably wrong, right? And something that they've been taught that was definitely wrong. And so you've got to like address that. And I feel like sometimes as advocates, we're too smart for ourselves, and we try to argue the wrong thing when people really just want to kind of talk about emotion to a certain extent.
What I really like that you just said, Sam, was you're talking about facts. And so, what surprises me with regard to the myths that you just talked about, Leonor, is that when I was in high school, I remember there was this comedy bit group called Culture Clash. And they did a take on, now I'm aging myself, but they did a take on the contest that happened at the border. They call them the border gladiators, I think it was. And the one gladiator represented ICE. And so he was saying that, I'm not going to let these immigrants take your job. And so then that was the protagonist or the antagonist of this comedy skit. And I thought that back then, I was like, that was funny because it's not true. But certainly I thought that since that time, and now I'm really aging myself because that was the 90s, I thought certainly we'll never hear that argument again, right? We're educated, we've learned about this, and then yet we still hear that. And so I believe that when I come across those myths, or even with my own clients, right, when they come in, and sometimes you'll have the immigrant and they're married to a US citizen, and the US citizen may still have these beliefs. And so we just talk about the facts. And then the other is look at history, look at our history. I was lucky enough to participate in a talk at St. Mary's, our sister campus. And we listened to a podcast in preparation for the class, and the podcast is called Constitutional Podcast, for those of you that want to check it out. One of the things that they talked about was that Benjamin Franklin was opposed to having this idea that if you were born in the United States, that you could become a US citizen, this idea of birthright citizenship. And he pointed to the German immigrants, that he was insulted that these German immigrants were reading their papers still in German, speaking German, and he was afraid that these German immigrants weren't going to integrate or assimilate to our country. And nowadays we think, well, certainly folks from Germany should have no issue or wouldn't have an issue coming to this country. And yet that was in our history, right? And throughout history, we've seen that there's been different pockets of immigrants that have been demonized and that have been treated as second-class citizens. And now what we're dealing with is that, who's next, right? Who's the next group that we're going to demonize, that we're going to be able to blame our issues on, right? And so I think that it's important that we look at those facts and that history. And one other thing I wanted to mention when we're talking about how things are happening now under the Biden administration, and many of us may feel like things aren't happening as quickly. I just want to share with you that, when regardless of how you feel about politics, right? I'm not trying to say, we're at Notre Dame, we're going to be, open-minded. You can be on either side of the aisle. But I'll tell you that as an advocate, that when President Biden won, when he won that election, they called it, I breathed a sigh of relief. Because under the Trump administration, and I'm not kidding, under the Trump administration, it just seemed like every week there was something else that was coming up, right? There was another obstacle that you think like, wait a minute, what? Like things that just didn't make sense. It was because of this, what we saw on the very first day that President Trump took office, right? He put an executive order and he laid out his priorities. Who is it that we're going to prioritize to remove from the United States? So on that first day in that executive order, he says, we're going to look for those people that are charged, that have been convicted of any crime. Okay, well, how are you going to argue with that? Okay, people who are charged with the crime. I mean, you can, but that's a conversation for later. But he's saying, okay, I don't care what crime you're convicted of, murder, rape, stealing a CD, drinking at the Notre Dame football game because you're not 21 yet. Those are misdemeanors or felonies, right? The misdemeanor under this administration, under the Trump administration, he said, okay, if you've been convicted of a crime, you're a priority. If you've been charged with the crime, but you haven't been found guilty yet, you're a priority. If you could have been charged with the crime, you weren't, you're a priority. And then the last one was if the officer believed that you were a threat to the government, right? Then you're a priority. And so what that meant was that everybody was a priority. And when everybody's a priority, nobody's a priority, right? And so at least under the Obama administration, what he had set specific priorities, right? We're going to look for people that commit these aggravated felonies, these serious crimes. We're going to look for people that were involved with gang activity, drugs, you know, these ideas that you believe, okay, well, that makes sense, right? These are people that could be a danger to our community because of crimes that were committed. And those are folks that we don't want here. So they made those individuals a priority. But they also had this concept of prosecutorial discretion that said that if you saw someone that was a contributing member of our society, was paying taxes, had no criminal history, had family members that were US citizens or legal permanent residents, that perhaps we could use our discretion to say, okay, we're not going to remove this person. This person isn't somebody that's going to be a priority. And so under the Trump administration, as I mentioned before, everybody was a priority. And now at least when President Biden took over, he set some priorities. And I believe it's more humane. It still takes into account that we want to be able to protect the United States, that there may be people that we don't want here in the country, right? Who's going to argue that if someone kills somebody else, that person, if they weren't born here in the if they didn't have a right to be here in the United States, that person should not be removed? Who's going to argue with that? But I would argue that perhaps somebody, okay, so they stole a CD. It was one time. I don't think that person should be removed from the United States. And I think that that's what we're trying to see, a more humane approach with regard to immigration and these issues that families are dealing with in our communities.
We can open it up to, if anyone has questions, please feel free to, this is kind of a small enough group that you can just chime in. You can use the chat or chime in if.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
So my kind of most pressing question as you're all talking was kind of like, there's obviously a lot of problems that need to be fixed going forward, especially like with the new administration being ushered in. But if you could kind of each of you might have like a different opinion, but I was thinking like, if there was one issue that you thought was the most time sensitive that you thought needs to be like immediately fixed and is like the most pressing for like kind of like from a human rights standpoint, what would you think that would be?
That was a really good question. Ms.
Go,
Cruz,
Rudy.
because nobody answered quickly. I guess I'll take a stab at it really quick. I would like for the 3 and the 10-year bars to be removed, right? We talk about 14 million people that are in the United States. That's a number that we keep hearing. It fluctuates, that there's 14 million people in the United States that are here unlawfully. and this conversation about let's wait in line, or why aren't people doing the things the right way? There are people that have a petition pending, and like my aunt, when my mother petitioned for my aunt to become a legal permanent resident, she waited 15, 20 years for that visa to become available. And so there's folks that are waiting the 15, 20 years in order for them to be able to legalize their status. So they are, have the petition that's pending. And so I think that if we took care of these 3 and the 10-year bars, that might resolve many of those issues. As an example, a U.S. citizen can petition for their spouse, their parents, and their children, so long as they're under the age of 21 and not married. They have a visa that's immediately available. And now we're starting to see that there are more U.S. citizens that are turning 21 that now will say, okay, well, great. No, well, let me legalize my parents' status because they've worked hard, and now here's my opportunity to be able to petition for them. So they can petition for them. There's a visa that's immediately available, but then the lawyer or the nonprofit agency or the advocate will tell them, well, you cannot apply for your green card because you entered the United States unlawfully and you have this unlawful presence. And so now the lawyer tells them, but you're going to have to leave the country in order to apply for your green card at an embassy. And then what happens is that they have that 10-year bar that Lisa talked about earlier. And there's no waiver for that. So you're telling these heads of households, these matriarchs, these patriarchs, yes, you can get your green card, but you'll have to leave the United States and you won't be able to come back for 10 years in order to do things the right way. And I think that's ridiculous. I think that's something that we need to fix. It doesn't take into account that there's there may be mixed status families, like a U.S. citizen spouse, U.S. citizen children, somebody who has DACA, somebody who's a legal permanent resident. We're breaking families, and you're giving families an impossible choice. You're telling them if you want to legalize your status, you can leave the country and wait outside the U.S. for 10 years, or you can stay here and have no status whatsoever, even though there's this visa available. So for me, I'd like to be able to see that unlawful presence removed, get rid of those 3 and the 10-year bars.
Yeah, I want to second the 3 and the 10-year bars. And then this might be cheating because it's a big, wide answer. But I think we need universal representation and appointed counsel in the immigration context. So because immigration law is civil, you don't have a lawyer unless you can hire one or find a volunteer or a nonprofit organization to represent you. So what that means is that even children who are going through the system, so these unaccompanied minors who are arriving at the border right now, unless they can find someone to represent them, they're going in front of an immigration judge on their own and trying to articulate their claim for asylum or whatever immigration defense is against a trained government prosecutor. And that's just not justice. And it also leads to incredible backlogs in the immigration court. So right now in Chicago, if Rudy or I went in tomorrow and asked the judge for their next available hearing date for us to put on an asylum trial, it might be 2023. They're probably getting close to 2024 at this point because we were getting scheduled in late 2023, which is a really long time for people to languish in the system. It's a really long time to have this anxiety and stress of the threat of deportation hanging over you. And it contributes to this idea that immigrants don't want to appear in court, that there's this catch and release. If we don't detain immigrants, if we don't put them on ankle monitors or ankle shackles, then they're not going to show up to court. When the statistics bear out that if someone has counsel, asylum seekers that have attorneys show up for court more than 90% of the time. And if you just look at the difference between who wins their case and who loses, if you have counsel, you're just exponentially more likely to access protection. So it makes for a way more efficient system. So if your concern is oh, these backlogs are taking forever and, people are just, the system is just grinding to a halt, adding counsel to help people make quick, informed decisions, so for people who we represent, if there is no immigration relief, there are people who then can make an informed decision. Do I want to try to fight my way and stay here, or do I want to cut my losses and take voluntary departure and avoid a removal order and maybe somehow be able to come back legally at some point in the future? So not having access to counsel, I think is one of the huge problems in our system.
I'm not even sure how this would work legally, but giving people the ability to work either faster or easier, because that's part of what causes a lot of the problems around people getting mad that people are working under the table. When it's well, they have to, but no one ever gets mad about people with privileges, side hustles that are cash, right? And so, but I think that's one. And then I think the whole, like, tracking social security number, how people are paying taxes or how that, right? If we just let everybody just have a social security number, right? Everybody wants to, and I think it breaks that myth, right? Everybody wants to pay our taxes. Trust me, immigrants want to pay our taxes. No one likes paying taxes, but we want to pay our taxes, right? Because we want to be above board. We want to follow the rules. And so I think that would break a lot of myths, probably be better for the country economically. But that would be one, especially for people who are waiting. Like I see people who are waiting on cases or trials or whatever's going on, and they've got 2-year wait and are supposed to not work. What do you do when, come on, you got to work. So I think more access to that would be probably something I would prioritize above maybe the long laundry list. But I love Rudy and Lisa's responses. Great question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was going to add, it's so interesting that you mentioned that, Sam, because, again, if we take a look at history, it used to be that everybody could get a social security number, right? The fact that you get a social security number doesn't mean that you have authorization to work. It means that they give you a social security number. And so but later, as the years went by, they tied that into immigration, that somehow by giving you a social security number, that meant that you had status, and that's not the case. But nowadays, you're absolutely correct. Nowadays, you're not going to get one unless you're able to prove that you're in the country lawfully, or that you have this right to be able to work. This idea of being able to work, Father Dan Grudy wrote this article, which I would encourage all of you to read. I believe it's called Crossing the Divide, where he talks about the law of man and he talks about the law of God, right? And so the law of man, that we want to protect our borders, that we want to see who has the right to be able to come into the country and who has a right to remain here. And when we talk about the law of God, which is why I always love speaking at Notre Dame and St. Mary's, because we can talk about faith without it being such a controversy. But the law of God says that we have a right to be able to provide for our families, that we have a right to be able to work, that we have a right to be able to feed our children, right? And so then, so for those of us, I just really want to stress that when we talk about these issues with regard to immigration, that it's not just about the laws, right? We're talking about humanity. That's the other thing that I appreciate with regard to the Biden administration, is that they've in that bill, but also with at least within how they talk to one another and the memorandums that they're going to send, they're no longer going to call individuals an illegal alien, right? We're going to call people either non-citizens or foreign nationals. And let me tell you why this, for me, it means a lot. Because I think when you call somebody, and again, I'll relate to, I have the little sticker here for La Casa de Amistad. No human being is illegal, right? This illegal, we're talking about an act, but no human being is illegal. But the other thing that makes me, that I wanted to mention with regard to this idea of calling people illegals or calling people illegal aliens, is that you're dehumanizing individuals, right? You're saying that because they're illegal or they're illegal aliens or whatever you want to say, you're saying that it's okay to treat these people as less. And that's not the case, right? We're all human beings. We all bleed the same. And so everybody should be treated with that same respect. And I think we need to be able to talk about that, right? We need to be able to have that be considered in the conversation when we're talking about immigration reform. And, this will remind me that there was that cartoon that was placed in the Observer, before I came to Notre Dame, and it was like the spring of '98, where somebody had put, okay, well, what's an illegal alien? An alien is what the joke was, right? They were showing different Halloween costumes, and they mentioned an alien, and what they showed under that picture was a picture that looked like me, except with the sombrero and a sarape. And so there was a lot of controversy that happened from that. Even then, this was back in '98 at Notre Dame. And so then, and we're still having that conversation today, right? And so words matter. The language that we use matter. And so I really appreciate this administration being able to say, we're not going to talk about people that way. We're going to respect them. We're going to recognize that they're human. And so that's what I would encourage all of us here, right? I mean, that's the important thing about being able to have a conversation, that we realize that we're talking about people. We're talking about humanity. We're talking about our fellow brothers and sisters, and that when you talk about immigration reform, you're talking about that. And if you want to go beyond that, we're also talking about U.S. citizens, right? It's not just the immigrant or the undocumented individual that's being impacted. It's U.S. citizens or people, by what people want to say, people that have the right to be here, or that people that can be here, they're being impacted. Even in our own community, we saw it, right? We saw that there was a restaurant that was run by somebody who had been removed before. And then all of a sudden, under the Trump administration, they were arrested. And so now we lost this amazing restaurant. And I don't know what happened afterwards. I forget. But I know that there was that people were like, wait a minute, what just happened? I thought we were removing those people, but not Joe, who I know, right? So we have to realize that when we're talking about this debate, that we're talking about lives and people that care about our community and care about this country.
Maybe another follow-up to that, and I don't want to take too much time so other people have questions, but I think we have to be careful not to overly romanticize the immigrant past of our country. And so two quick examples on that. A lot of people will be, right, it's Dingus Day, right? So today is a day in South Bend that we celebrate kind of Polish heritage and Polish immigrants. And, a lot of people will be like, why don't they do it the right way like my Polish grandma did? And, historically, so once again, I'm not a historian, I'm not an attorney, right? But way back in the day, you just showed up to Ellis Island and you didn't have the plague and you got to stay. And that was really like the litmus test, right? And so when people try to then, they always want to raise the hurdle. Then the other one, people always say like, oh, we're a melting pot, we're a nation of immigrants and we've always welcomed immigrants. The United States has always hated immigrants. We've hated all of them, right? So we didn't like the Irish and we called them drunks. We didn't like the Italians, we called them criminals. We didn't like the Polish, we called them dumb. And we haven't learned. So it's part of like, we try to be careful of like, don't be like, oh, this US is just, everyone's just come here and always been happy. Unfortunately, it's been, I don't know if it's hazing of immigrants or not, but it's always been a negative thing. And it should be our job to try to change it. Not that we want to change it to this romanticized past that we want to go back to. We want to make it better in the future and say, you know what, the Irish should have been welcomed for the contributions they brought this community, and that the Polish built up the west side of South Bend and made this a beautiful place. And so like those kind of like, we need to change those narratives to help it continue into today's narrative by really trying to reconcile with what really happened in the past today.
I have one last question, but I don't want to, I know we're kind of pressed on time here at the end. So if anyone else has any questions that come to your mind. No? Okay. Well, my last question focuses on the idea of sanctuary policies. And I'm going to condense this because I did have a kind of a personal anecdote of what happened on our own campus. But so my understanding is that under a sanctuary policy, state and local officials will limit their cooperation with federal immigration officials, but cannot actively prevent federal officials from carrying out their immigration enforcement duties. Some may argue that declaring a city or even a campus as sanctuary is just one type of symbolic gesture, and that there are many other ways that communities can build trust and equity-minded infrastructures that aim to truly integrate immigrants as important members of the community. So my question is, what kind of municipal policies and practices do you think have long-lasting positive effects for our immigrant communities? Can you give us some examples? Maybe this is geared towards Sam first. What kind of examples, maybe the city ID or some of these policies or practices that might actually be working towards integration?
So I would say one of the things that I just generally give as advocate advice is that, try to work in your sphere, your bubble, right? If you can change the minds of people that you know and you work with and you see every day, that makes a difference. And so the other one and I don't know if Rudy or Lisa will touch on it, but there's no real definition of a sanctuary city, right? There's no like, once you've done these 5 things, it's official, right? And there's no checkbox. I would say South Bend is probably one of the most welcoming immigrant-friendly communities in the country, not listed as a sanctuary city, but doing more things to support immigrants. And I think most cities that say they're sanctuary cities do. And one of those things is that we have a municipal identification program. It's actually operated by La Casa de Amistad, not by the city. So it's not technically a city ID program. but it's as good as one would be, and safer, since it's not a government-run program. There's no Freedom of Information Act on the data that we collect. So, so I think things like that, and it was important for us to see that, one, it was supported for the community, but then the other people who didn't need to have the ID came out and got them. And the immigrant community saw that and noticed that, like, oh yeah, like it's a way that people stood in solidarity with our immigrant community by putting that out there. And that, our mayor at the time, Mayor Pete, took a lot of shots based on that. And so, and I think whether they were good or bad for his political career, I don't know. I'd like to think he wouldn't care either way, but that he did it because it was the right thing, and our community noticed that and responded. So I would say that's something. But I think as a community, it's important that how we welcome the stranger in our own community, right? We can't say everybody in Texas and Arizona should be nice to people crossing the border. No, like we could be nice to people right here in South Bend, Indiana, who've crossed the border, whether it was like me in 1985 or somebody who just did it a month ago. We can welcome folks in this community, and we can be an example to others of what it should look like.
Yeah, I have two things building on Sam's. One is, I think communities who are really good at welcoming immigrants tend to have really strong public schools. And so I think, making sure that we have resources. A lot of times the public schools are that's the point of contact for immigrant families, those parent liaisons, those bilingual educators. Those are the people that are connecting immigrant families with, whether it's legal services or social services, or just providing them with support or giving them accurate information or helping them, not be afraid that when they drop their kids off from school, if ICE comes, just really, I think that's a important foundation in the community, and making sure that those institutions stay strong is really important. The other thing that St. Joe County has done that Elkhart County, where I live, has not done yet is explicitly St. Joe County does not honor ICE detainers. So that means when people get picked up and taken into criminal custody, again, oftentimes as a result of racial profiling or other issues in St. Joe County, those individuals, once they're detained, are not automatically passed on to ICE. So ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and ICE does a lot of collaboration with local law enforcement, and local law enforcement is not required by law to do it. And so in Elkhart County, when they pick up somebody who they believe is undocumented, who sometimes isn't, and that's always really ambiguous and unclear, but in Elkhart County, they'll cooperate with ICE, and if ICE sends them this thing called a detainer, they'll say, okay, we'll hang on to this person, even once we no longer have a criminal reason to hang on to this person. They've paid their bond or their charges were dropped or whatever. In Elkhart County, they'll still hold on to them for ICE to come and pick them up and take them into ICE detention. St. Joe County doesn't do that because grassroots advocates, organizers did excellent work within recent years, really pushing law enforcement locally to not honor detainers. And so I think that's a huge thing that keeps the community safe and prevents families from being destroyed by ICE detention. And it is an area of improvement that lots of other counties in Indiana need to follow.
Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned that, Lisa. When I first started practicing law here in 2001, St. Joseph County used to hold people in detention. And so I think that really emphasizes, when we take a look at what happened in our own community, it emphasizes how lawyers, advocates, nonprofits, and community members can really make a difference in your own communities, right? So even though we may not be considered a sanctuary city, per se, there's people here that care about their community. And so that was through the, for a while, they were holding people, that detainer that Lisa was talking about, it was a voluntary request. It's like, hey, we would like for you to hold this individual. We have reason to believe that they're here unlawfully. You're authorized to hold them for 48 hours, not including holidays. And what we would see jails throughout the state, I'll talk about Indiana, do, is that they would hold them for longer than, first of all, they didn't have to, right? St. Joseph's argument is that sounds to me like a judicial order, right? That sounds to me like that's something that a judge should sign, not an ICE officer. And so then that's St. Joseph County's position, which we happen to agree with, that it should be a judge that orders that whether or not a person should be detained, not an ICE officer. And so that's why St. Joe doesn't recognize that. But for the longest time, they were holding individuals for longer than 48 hours. I've heard stories where people were in detention for a year waiting for ICE to come pick them up, and they never came. And so then lawyers would come in and file habeas petitions, get them out, get them in front of a judge, and then the judge would have the opportunity to hear, why are you holding this individual still? There's no reason to. And so, but it wasn't just the lawyers. It was La Casa de Amistad. It was Jesus Rivera. It was advocates, right, within our community that said, we're not going to stand for this. And they pushed, and they were able to reason with those that had power, right? And so I think that's a very important piece to remember, that you don't just have to be an attorney or even work in the field of immigration. I think if something is really important to you, that you can stand up with your community and others within the community to make a difference. And I think that issue with detainers is a great example of how we can support our communities, our immigrant communities here in St. Joseph County.
Ooh, and U visa certifications related to that. St. Joe County law enforcement. I'm sorry, you were trying to wrap up, and I'm sure there was going to finish, but one more thing. No, so local law enforcement can sign. Remember, I was talking about those U visas. There are 10,000 visas available a year to immigrant survivors of crimes. You can only get those visas if your local law enforcement certifies that you have been cooperative in the investigation and prosecution of a crime. And in St. Joe County, there is just a wonderful protocol in place. And sometimes it gets gummed up and takes too long, but for the most part, we can reason with law enforcement in St. Joe County and get them to sign these critical certifications that allow survivors of domestic violence and other crimes to access protection, leave their abusers, get employment authorization, stabilize their lives, and get permanent status. In other jurisdictions, again, including my own Elkhart County, we just have a terrible time getting law enforcement to work with us on that. And it's absolutely ridiculous. It should be a no-brainer, but having the public kind of lean on our elected officials, our locally elected officials, so this is sheriffs, this is prosecutors, this is judges, on things like, hey, you should meaningfully consider U visa certification requests when they come before you, and you should not have a blanket policy to reject them. Those are really local things that we can do to push our communities to be more protective of and welcoming to immigrants.
Well, thank you so much. This was very informative, and I just want to I don't, Kristen, do you want to maybe, I see your whole background banner and I'm hoping that we can at least plug in and welcome you guys all to participate in some of our other events this week.
Yes, I'll share it. So we have the link in our chat, and I also have it behind me. So we have Pause for a Breath tomorrow at noon if you want to join on Zoom. And then we also have our guest speaker, Dr. Aurora Chang. She's going to be talking about the cycle of hyperdocumentation. So if you're interested in registering for those events, we have included the link in our chat as well.
So thank you everyone for attending, and to our guests for sharing their expertise. And if you have any follow-up questions, we would be happy to send them over and continue the conversation in other ways. So thank you. Have a really good night.
Thank you, everybody.